They pass through your life like a gentle breeze, carrying change, protection, and sometimes warnings that no one wants to hear. They don't seek attention, nor do they crave the glory of this world. They appear at the right time, in the right place, fulfilling the exact mission God has entrusted to them. But then one day, they disappear. No trace, no farewell. And only when they are gone does the world begin to feel their absence. Chaos rises. The veil hiding the truth is torn apart, and those who once ignored them start to ask, what happened? In this powerful video, we will dive deep into the profound truth that God's chosen ones often walk a difficult and misunderstood path. From being a temporary disruption in the world to planting seeds on hardened ground, we will explore the divine mission that many are called to, but few truly understand. If you've ever felt misunderstood or questioned your purpose, this video will shine a light on the greater plan behind your journey. If this is your first time visiting our channel, don't forget to like and subscribe so you can stay updated with our latest videos on spiritual topics, inner awakening, and philosophical insights. God's chosen ones do not get the luxury of blending in. They don't walk through life unnoticed, slipping by without resistance. Their presence alone shifts the atmosphere, not because they seek attention or provoke conflict, but because they carry something that disrupts the status quo. They challenge what has been accepted for too long. They shine a light on things that others would rather keep hidden. Their mere existence forces a decision: align with truth or resist it. From the moment they step into a place, things begin to change. Long-standing structures built on deception, generational cycles of dysfunction, systems sustained by lies, these begin to weaken. The spiritual complacency that once felt comfortable suddenly becomes unsettling. People around them grow uneasy, sometimes without even understanding why. It's not because of the chosen one's personality or presence. It's because of the divine authority they carry. This is why rejection is almost inevitable. God's chosen are often misunderstood, betrayed, and cast aside. Not because they have failed, but because they are fulfilling exactly what they were sent to do. They weren't placed here to make peace with dysfunction. They weren't called to tolerate deception. They were sent to expose it. That's why they were never meant to be popular. They were never meant to fit in. They were called to be a reminder that darkness has an expiration date. But here's the truth that many miss: their time in any given place is limited. They were never meant to stay forever. When their mission is complete, God removes them, not randomly, not as an afterthought, but with precision. When they are gone, their absence is felt like a missing pillar in a collapsing building. Some will realize too late what they had. Others will come to understand that the very thing they resisted was the only thing holding back the judgment they now face. The chosen weren't here for comfort. They were here to collide with everything that was never meant to stand. And when God calls them away, it is not a retreat. It is a final, undeniable statement. A statement that what was once hidden has been revealed, and what was once tolerated will no longer stand. Leaving doesn't mean losing. It doesn't mean failure, surrender, or unfinished business. When God pulls his chosen ones out, it's not because they weren't strong enough to stay. It's because their very presence has already done what it was meant to do. They were never called to fix everything. They were never meant to carry the weight of an entire system, a broken generation, or a corrupted foundation. Their assignment was never to repair. It was to shift. And once that shift happens, their removal is not just necessary. It's strategic. Some might see their departure as abandonment. Others might assume it means they weren't as powerful as they seemed. That's the mistake people always make. They assume God's chosen ones are supposed to hold everything together indefinitely, as if their prayers, their presence, and their faith alone are what keeps the chaos at bay. But they were never meant to be the foundation. They were only meant to be a sign, a warning, a temporary shield. And once they are gone, what was ignored, dismissed, or fought against will come full force. People rarely realize the significance of someone's presence until that presence is removed. When the chosen ones leave, things don't just stay the same, they unravel. Not because the chosen wanted destruction, but because their very departure is proof that grace has shifted. The time for warning is over. Now comes the response to everything that was refused, ridiculed, and resisted. God does not pull his people out without a reason. It is always a sign that something is about to change, and not in a way most people are ready for. Those who thought they had more time, those who assumed they could keep resisting, those who believed they were in control. They are about to see what happens when the ones holding back the storm are no longer standing in the way. Because when God removes his chosen, he's not just shifting people, he's shifting history. God never places his chosen ones randomly. They don't just appear in people's lives by accident. They are assigned, strategically, intentionally, to specific moments, places, and people. Whether it's a nation, a city, a family, or even just one individual, their presence is an answer to a spiritual crisis. A crisis that most don't even recognize until it's too late. But here's what many fail to understand. They were never meant to stay. Their role was always temporary. Their mission had a deadline. They weren't sent to settle, they were sent to shift. Their presence was a divine response to a problem that wouldn't be addressed any other way. They were there to intervene, to expose, to give one last opportunity for change. And once that crisis had been confronted, whether through exposure, warning, or realignment, their assignment was over. And when the assignment is over, so is their time there. This is where most people make their mistakes. They assume God's chosen ones will always be around, always interceding, always covering, always holding back the collapse. They take for granted the wisdom, the prayers, the supernatural protection. Some even resist them, dismissing their presence, rejecting their words, or assuming they'll always be there regardless of how they're treated. But then, one day, they're no explanation, no warning, no delay, just gone. And that's when reality sets in. The ones who ignored them begin to feel the absence. The peace they never noticed vanished. The favor that surrounded them lifted. The silent covering that protected them no longer there. And that's when they realize the chosen ones weren't just another voice, another presence, another ordinary person. They were the reason things hadn't fallen apart sooner. And now, that covering is gone. Because when God removes his chosen, it's never random. It's always because their work is done. And for those left behind, it's not a relief, it's a warning. Because when the ones carrying the light are no longer there, darkness doesn't just return, it takes over. People love the idea of being chosen by God until they realize what it actually costs. Being chosen doesn't come with applause. It doesn't guarantee admiration or acceptance. It doesn't make you popular, it makes you a problem. Because being chosen means walking into places where you are not wanted. It means speaking truth people don't want to hear. It means challenging the systems they have built their lives around. And for that, you will be labeled difficult, extreme, dangerous, not because you are wrong, but because you refuse to be silent. History proves it. The prophets weren't celebrated. They were stoned, exiled, imprisoned, and murdered. Jesus himself, the greatest of all, wasn't embraced. He was betrayed, falsely accused, and crucified by the very people he came to save. So why would it be different for those he sends? God's chosen ones are not assigned to make people comfortable in their illusions. They are sent to tear them down, to expose deception, to shake up systems, to remind the world that God is watching. But here's the problem. People love darkness more than light. They don't want to be awakened. They don't want to change. They want to be left alone. So when a chosen one steps in, carrying truth like a sword, resistance is inevitable. But understand this, the rejection is not personal. It's prophetic. The world has always pushed back against the messengers of truth. They mock them, they dismiss them. They try to destroy them, thinking that if they silence the messenger, they can silence the message. But the truth remains, and so does the consequence of ignoring it. So if you find yourself misunderstood, rejected, or even hated, don't be surprised. You weren't sent to be liked. You weren't sent to be accepted. You were sent to be a warning. Whether they listen or not is up to them. But your mission was never about being loved. It was about making sure they had no excuse when the time came. There's a painful truth that every chosen one has to accept. Not everyone will change, no matter how much truth they receive. You can preach, warn, pray, and pour everything you have into people, but some will never wake up. Not because they don't understand, but because they don't want to. It's easy to believe that if you just say the right words, if you show them enough love, if you give them enough proof, they'll finally open their eyes. But the reality is, some hearts are already set in stone. Some people aren't just asleep, they're actively resisting the truth. Not because they're blind to it, but because it threatens them. It challenges their comfort, it disrupts their power, it shatters their illusions. And the hardest lesson you'll ever learn? You cannot force transformation that only God can bring. That's why your mission was never about fixing the world. It was about giving the world a chance. Every word you spoke, every warning you gave, every tear you shed, every moment you spent trying to wake people up, it wasn't for your own satisfaction. It was so that when the time comes, when everything they ignored finally collapses, they won't be able to say, "I didn't know." Because here's the truth, it's not your job to make people listen. It's your job to deliver the message. Whether they accept it or reject it is between them and God. Some will hear and turn, some will ignore and fall. But either way, you did what you were sent to do, so don't carry the weight of their choices. Don't let their resistance become your burden. Don't let their rejection make you doubt your purpose. You were never sent to change the world in the way you hoped. You were sent to make sure the world had no excuse when judgment came. Everything you went through, the betrayals, the rejection, the isolation, the suffering, it was never just about you. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't random hardship. It was a message. You were a living prophecy, a warning wrapped in human flesh. God's chosen ones don't just speak the truth, they become it. Before they ever open their mouths, their lives preach the sermon. Before they ever warn others, their own suffering becomes the evidence. Every scar, every heartbreak, every moment of endurance, it wasn't for nothing. It was a divine illustration. Some people ignore words, but they can't ignore what is written on your life. That's why the attacks came. That's why people turned on you. That's why doors closed that should have opened. That's why you were misunderstood, ridiculed, or dismissed. Not because you were wrong, but because your life exposed what others wanted to keep hidden. You didn't just talk about endurance. You endured. You didn't just warn about betrayal. You lived through it. You didn't just speak of rejection. You felt it firsthand. Your suffering was the proof that what you carried was real. And those who watched you suffer, they were left with a choice. They could learn from what you went through, or they could pretend they never saw it. Some will wake up because of your pain. Others will ignore it until they experience it for themselves. But either way, your suffering wasn't wasted. So don't see your scars as just wounds. They are the evidence that you carried the message. You weren't sent just to warn people. You were sent to become the warning. And whether they listen or not, your life will stand as proof that they had every chance to pay attention. People don't always recognize what they have until it's gone. They hear, but they don't listen. They see, but they don't understand. They assume they have time. They assume there will always be another chance. They assume they can ignore, dismiss, or reject you without consequence. And then one day, you're no longer there. No more warnings, no more prayers, no more presence holding things together. That's when reality hits. Your absence is not just a disappearance, it's a divine announcement. The people who ignored you, mocked you, or brushed off your words will start to notice the difference. The peace they took for granted, gone. The protection they didn't even realize was covering them, lifted. The wisdom they rolled their eyes at, suddenly makes sense. This is how God works. He removes his chosen ones, not just to protect them, but to wake up those who refused to listen while they had the chance. Some will reflect and realize they made a mistake. Some will mourn the loss of what they never valued. Others will scramble to find someone else to fill the void. But it won't be the same, because what you carried wasn't just knowledge, kindness, or insight. It was a divine assignment. And assignments can't be replaced by convenience. Your silence now speaks louder than your presence ever did. Because now, people aren't just hearing what you said, they're feeling the absence of what you carried. And that's the real warning. If your presence was a form of grace, then your absence is the reminder that grace has limits. For too long, they assumed you would always be there. For too long, they assumed they could dismiss you and still be fine. For too long, they assumed they could resist truth without consequence. But now, your silence is the consequence. Those who ignored you, rejected you, or underestimated you will have to live with the fact that they had access to something rare, something divine, and they let it slip away. Your presence in people's lives was never random. You were sent for a purpose, not just to help, not just to teach, but to test. And here's the truth. The test was never about you. It was about them, how they treated you, how they responded to you, whether they listened or rejected you. Every choice they made was being recorded. Some assumed they were dealing with just another ordinary person. They thought they had the luxury of disregarding you. But in reality, they were dealing with a divine assignment. Throughout history, God has sent people as warnings, as opportunities, as second chances. And time again, history repeats itself. They are ignored, they are mocked, they are mistreated, they are even attacked. Jesus himself was rejected in his own hometown. Prophets were ridiculed, silenced, and killed. The world has a history of failing these tests and suffering the consequences afterward. Some of the people you encountered had a chance to recognize who you were and align themselves accordingly, a chance to receive the blessing that came with your presence. But instead, they gossiped, they doubted, they dismissed. Some even worked against you, not because they didn't know better, but because they refused to accept that God had placed something sacred right in front of them. Now the test is over. Their response has sealed their fate. The time they had to treat you correctly, to listen, to take heed, is gone. Some will realize too late who you were and what you carried. They will look back and wish they had seen differently. But realization doesn't erase judgment. It doesn't reverse the consequences. Because when God removes his chosen, it's not just about relocation. It's about closing the book on those who refuse to see. The test has been graded, the results are final. And now, they will live with what they chose. Your life isn't just about you. Your purpose isn't just for your own fulfillment or comfort. You were never just living for yourself. You were part of something far greater. You are a soldier in a battle far beyond what the natural eye can see. A war that has been raging since the beginning of time. Between light and darkness, truth and deception, righteousness and rebellion. And when God moves you, it's never random. It's never an accident. It's strategic. A soldier doesn't question why the general repositions them. They don't demand to understand every detail of the mission. They don't resist when they're called to shift. They trust the plan. And in the same way, when God pulls you from one place to another, it's not because you failed. It's not because you weren't strong enough. It's because your assignment has changed. Some battles require your presence. Others require your absence. And when God says it's time to move, it's not just about you. It's about the war advancing in a way bigger than you. You might not understand it now. You might feel like you were making a difference where you were. You might wonder why he's pulling you out right when it seemed like you were gaining ground. But here's what you must remember. God sees the battlefield from above. He sees the traps being set. He sees the next attack forming before it even begins. He sees the hidden enemies, the shifting alliances, the unseen dangers that would never be obvious from where you stand. And so he moves you, not as an afterthought, not as a retreat, but as a calculated strategy. Sometimes your removal is the very thing that sets the next phase of the battle in motion. Sometimes your exit creates the conditions for what must come next. And sometimes your absence forces people to realize that the battle was never about you. It was about the war God has been waging all along. So trust him. If he's moving you, it's because the next mission requires it, the next battlefield demands it, and the next victory is already being prepared. You weren't just placed in this war, you were chosen for it. and the God who positioned you before knows exactly where to place you next. What many don't realize is that your presence wasn't just a comfort, it was a shield. God's favor rested on places, people, and situations because of you, not because of their righteousness, not because of their faithfulness, but because you were there. You were the covering they didn't deserve, the grace they couldn't earn, the protection they never even knew they had. Your life was like a spiritual umbrella, extending mercy and favor even where it wasn't asked for or acknowledged. And while you were there, they lived under the blessing that followed you. The job that stayed afloat despite poor leadership, the family that held together despite dysfunction, the community that thrived when it should have crumbled. All of it was possible because you were there, in the center of it, carrying God's favor. But when your assignment is over and God removes you, that umbrella is taken away. The grace they enjoyed, withdrawn. The protection they unknowingly leaned on, lifted. The consequences they avoided while you were there will now catch up to them. And when it does, reality will hit hard. The peace they didn't realize was connected to you, gone. The unexplainable favor that seemed to follow them, now they'll see it for what it truly was. Borrowed, temporary, and tied to your presence. Some will try to call on that protection after you're gone. They'll seek the same grace that once covered them, but it will be too late. Because the covering you provided was never theirs to keep. It was always a result of your obedience, your faith, and your assignment. And now that assignment has shifted. For some, this will be a wake-up call, a harsh realization that the grace they took for granted has vanished, that the warnings they ignored weren't just words, they were their only lifeline. And now, they will have to face the full weight of their choices, the reality of what was hidden under the covering you provided. And in that moment, perhaps too late, they'll wonder why they didn't recognize the weight of your presence sooner. You were never meant to be a permanent fixture. God's chosen ones are placed strategically, not to set up camp, but to create disruption. You weren't sent to blend in, or to be a constant. You were a temporary force of divine disturbance, a wrecking ball designed to shake things up and get things moving. And let's be honest, that kind of fire doesn't burn forever in the same place. If you had stayed too long, if you had tried to settle in, that fire would have dimmed. And what was once a blaze of truth and change would have turned into a pile of cold ashes. God doesn't send his chosen to fit in, he sends them to unsettle. Whether it's a situation, a mindset, or a group of people, you were placed there to stir things up, to challenge, to awaken, and sometimes to make people uncomfortable. That's the job of the divine wrecking ball, to destroy what isn't built on truth, to tear down what isn't rooted in God's will, and to push people out of their complacency. But the job is never permanent. If you stayed too long, people would have stopped listening. The sting would have faded, the challenge would have been forgotten. God's fire doesn't exist to be smothered in familiarity. It's meant to burn brightly, intensely, and with purpose. And when the time comes for it to move on, it does, before it becomes dull. Your time in that place was always temporary. Your presence was never meant to last forever. You were sent to create a shift, to cause a stir, and then to move on. And when you leave, the echo of your disruption remains, leaving behind the very change that was needed. Success doesn't always look the way we expect it to. For most people, success means seeing the results of their labor, watching their hard work produce something tangible, something rewarding. But for you, success was never about reaping, it was about planting. You were sent to the hard ground, the places others couldn't reach, the soil that was too dry, too rocky, too resistant for anyone else to work with. Your mission wasn't to gather the harvest, it was to break through the tough, untouched places, to prepare the land, to do the back-breaking work of softening what had been hardened for years. It's easy to think your work was incomplete because you didn't see growth, because you never saw the fruit of your labor, because you left before anything seemed to change. But your calling was never about visible results. You weren't meant to stay long enough to see the plants sprout or the crops grow. Your job was to prepare the land for someone else. You were the one cracking open hearts that had been closed for years, breaking down barriers others thought were unbreakable, shifting things in the spiritual realm that others didn't even know needed shifting. And even if you never saw the outcome, even if you left wondering if anything had changed, you planted seeds. Seeds that someone else will water. Seeds that, in time, will grow into something greater. The reality is, not all seeds grow immediately. Some take years, some won't even sprout in your lifetime. But that doesn't mean your work was meaningless. It doesn't mean your assignment was wasted. You were a cultivator, not a harvester. And sometimes the hardest work is the work no one sees. The quiet, unseen labor of preparing for a harvest you will never personally experience. But that was never the point. Your mission was never about instant gratification. It was about planting in the places others feared to tread, and trusting that one day, someone else will come along and gather the fruit. When God removes His chosen, it's never a quiet, unnoticed departure. It's a prophetic alarm, a clear signal that something is about to shift, and not in the way people expect. You weren't just a presence. You weren't just another voice. You were the last call, the final warning. And now that you're gone, the time for mercy has ended. The moment God pulls you out of a situation, a relationship, a workplace, a community, it's not the end of your influence. It's the beginning of judgment. You were the last defense against what was coming. You were the one standing in the gap, the barrier between them and the storm. Think of it this way. Your time there wasn't just about speaking truth. It was about holding back a wave of consequences, interceding, standing between God's patience and His justice. You may have felt like your voice was ignored, like your warnings didn't matter, like your presence was dismissed. But while you were there, grace remained. And now that you're gone, the storm is free to come. The people, the systems, the places you influenced will now face the reality of their actions. This isn't about punishment for you. This is about the accountability of others, how they treated you, how they rejected your warnings, how they ignored the message you carried. It all has consequences. Your exit isn't the end of your legacy. It's the moment they will have to answer for how they responded to what you brought. And for some, the awakening will come too late. Those who mocked you, dismissed you, or worked against you will now see the cost of their refusal to recognize the messenger. Because when God moves His chosen, the silence that follows isn't peace. It's a prelude to judgment. And for those who didn't listen, your departure will be the loudest reminder that they had their chance and they wasted it. But here's what you must remember. Your mission was never meant to be glamorous. It was never about recognition, applause, or fitting in. It was never about being loved, accepted, or praised. It was always about obedience. And now that it's time for you to leave, don't look back. Your assignment is sealed. Nothing can change that. You did what you were sent to do. And now, it's time to go. What do you think about the content in this video? Which of these points resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch the video in its entirety. If you're interested in exploring more topics on spirituality, inner transformation, or mind philosophy, don't forget to subscribe to the Top Hidden Knowledge channel for more content on wisdom, spirituality, and personal growth. Or, if you have time, check out other videos on this channel. Until next time.